I asked God for strength that I might achieve, that I was made weak, that I might learn humbly to obey. I asked for health that I might do greater things, and I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I asked for riches that I might be happy, and I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked for power that I might have the praise of men, and I was made weak that I might feel the need of God. I asked for all things that I might enjoy life, and I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I asked for, but I got everything I had hoped for, almost despite myself. My unspoken prayers were answered. I, among all men, am most richly blessed. My name's Bob Davis. I'm an alcoholic. Man, what a great looking group. I don't know if I've seen a better looking group of sick people in a long time. ah, Thank you, Stephen, for asking. We're over 200. That's my minimum. That's a joke. That's a joke. I'm always amazed if I could get two people to stand and listen to me talk. I certainly couldn't when I walked in. And I walked in here on April 13th, 1983. I know it's hard to believe. I got sober when I was 7. And what's that, 13,663 days in a row. And, I went to a live conference last weekend, and I spent some time with some old friends, and we had a lot of conversations about Alcoholics Anonymous, and some of it revolved around the situation that we've been in for the last 6 months and in the world, essentially. And I came out of there with, as I generally do at an AA conference, with a profound feeling of gratitude or grace or appreciation or for God's grace and mercy, but more so for our fellowship. And the fact that Alcoholics Anonymous is a triangle of 3 equal parts. We have the fellowship and the unity and the recovery and the book and the service and the work that we do to help each other and the fellowship itself. And there is no other one side that's more important than the other. They're all important. And I love the form. I love the platform that we have and the things that we've learned, because it's allowed me to meet literally thousands of people that I would have never met, because I'm a meeting whore. I just am. I love meetings. I always have, and I hope I always will, because that's where I hear God's message most. I've never been to an AA meeting where God was not present. And so I appreciate that. I'm a real alcoholic. And I say that, because I think it's incredibly important that real alcoholics identify. And what do I mean by that? I suffer from a physical allergy to the beverage alcohol. When I drink, I get thirsty. The more I drink, the thirstier I get. And when I get sober, I can't stand it. I can't live sober. And I get to a point to where I'm restless, irritable, and discontent, and I suffer from an obsession that forces me to go back to the thing that I'm allergic to. And I get in a never-ending spiral that burns my life to the ground, and I drink till the bottle's empty or the money's gone or I'm put away somewhere where I can't get anymore. I'm physically incapacitated to a point where I can't drink. I don't ever know where this is going to go, because sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's sad. It is always a story of a young man who was very lost in this world and had no idea where he was going, but was going somewhere fast. And I'd love to blame it on a family where there was breaking furniture and breaking glass and screaming and guns going off and blood and flesh hitting flesh, but that wasn't the way it is. My family was very normal. not dysfunctional until a traumatic event happened. And that was, I started walking and got potty trained. It became very dysfunctional from that point on. I had my first drink at 11 years old. I got drunk, I passed out, I blacked out, I got sick, and I got laid. And I woke up terribly sick the next day, and I had one thought, and that's, when can I do this again? And I didn't drink. I wasn't an alcoholic, I don't think. When I drank alcoholically, but I think, like the book says, if I had been given a sufficient reason, I could have stopped maybe in the first couple years. But by the time I was 15, I was taking a pint of liquor to school every morning. I was selling dope in the parking lot. And I started a little business selling party favors, and I ended up building that up, making a lot of money. I went to college when I was 17. I remember my dad packing my stuff for me and putting it in the car. And as I hugged my mother to go to school, he stopped me and he said, "You will never live here again." He said, "You can visit, but you can't live here again." And he held that true to that. I went to school in 1977. I spent the best 3 years of my life, my freshman year at East Carolina University. It was fun. I'm not one of those people who says my worst day sober is better than my best day drinking. I had some hell of fun drinking. I can't, being walked into a correctional facility is not more fun than drinking with a beautiful blonde on a Friday night. So that just isn't true for me. But, my drinking progressed very rapidly. And I don't spend a whole lot of time on, our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened to what we are like now. But there's another part of how it works I like even better. This is our personal adventures before and after. And I always ask the question, before and after what? And I used to think in the beginning that it was before and after I stopped drinking. I've come to believe that really it's before and after I have a spiritual experience. Our personal adventures before and after, and that's really what I love to talk about. I went to school when I was 17. Between 17 and 23, I was arrested 56 times. I had 12 DUIs. I was shot 3 times. I was beaten within an inch of my life several times. I blew up every relationship that I ever had. My parents had restraining orders out against me. I hadn't seen my brother and sister in a couple years. I had been disowned, essentially, and I came here without a friend. Not one. I was married, and she wasn't even my friend. I still can't believe she married me, but she did. And I want to just talk about a couple things. I mean, there's one incident in college where I was sitting in an apartment one night with a bunch of friends, and 30 DEA agents busted in the door and tore the house apart. And I was looking at like 40 years in jail, and I drove home to my parents' house. And I didn't even have enough guts to talk to them. I just left a note on the kitchen table saying, if you guys don't help me, I'm going to go to jail for a very long time. And I'm sure it was my mother. She's never admitted to it, but she talked my dad into mortgaging their home to pay a lawyer to get me out of the trouble I was in. And the day I went to court and got out, and one of the stipulations was I was not to be in an establishment that sold alcohol in the county, I walked right by the cop into my regular bar that same night and got drunk. I had no regard for anything. I had no regard for life, for respect, for any of that. And I went on to where I was 19. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous for the first time after a particularly bad week of time where I won't even go into all the stuff that happened, but I ended up in an AA meeting after getting out of jail the night before, where I'd been beaten up really bad. I walked into an AA meeting with both eyes swollen shut, 4 broken ribs, a dislocated jaw, and sat down in a meeting. And a guy named Red Everett, Red became a great friend of mine later, but he walked up and he looked at me, he said, "You don't look too good, kid." And he said, "Why don't you go try some controlled drinking?" I mean, he didn't even try to tell me anything about AA. He just told me straight up. He knew I wasn't there for anything because I had to be there. And I went to a second meeting on a Saturday night. That was a Thursday. I went on Saturday. They told me the same thing. It was the same 20 farmers with bib overalls. I mean, I was 19. They were 70. You couldn't be cool and hang out with these guys. And he told me to go try some controlled drinking. And I did that. And for the next 4.5 years, I tried every day of my life to control my drinking. And if I controlled it, I didn't enjoy it. And if I enjoyed it, it certainly wasn't under control. You know, and it ended up, you know, in 1982, I got married to that same girl in August. She was a nurse. She got a job. I actually got a job. And about 8 months later, I was driving home from work drunk, and I ran into the back of a station wagon with a mom and 3 kids at a stoplight. They were stopped. I didn't. And they took me to jail for hopefully the last time. It was in January of 1983. And my wife called my parents. I never called my father. I called him the first time and he hung up the phone. I never called him again. And I had made enough money to get myself out of trouble most of the time. But he came with my mother to the jail that night, and he came for a reason. He came to give me a message. Probably the most important message I ever got. He walked in and I was sitting in a chair. He walked in, he walked straight up to me, looked me dead in the eye. He said, "Boy, you are the biggest disappointment I've ever had. I wish you were never born." And I mean, if you're an alcoholic like me, you've seen that look in the eyes of someone who loves you deeply, but also hates you at the same time. You know, that is disappointed and confused and bewildered and frustrated that they've tried everything they know to help you, and they just know that there's no help. There is no human power. And I thought to myself sitting there in that chair, damn you, if you only knew how bad I wanted to be a good son. You only knew how bad I wanted to be a good brother or a good friend or a good person or a good worker. If you only knew how bad I wanted to do that. I just can't do that. Every time I try to do that, I take a drink. And when I take a drink, all bets are off. See, because I mean, I was a terrible blackout drinker. My last blackout was 17 days. I went to drink on a Friday night and woke up 17 days later, 1,200 miles away from where I was with people I'd never seen before in the back of a van in a pair of shorts and flip-flops. I left fully clothed with a pocket full of money. And I had no idea what I'd done or where I'd been or who I'd hurt or what trouble I'd been in. But that was normal. That was normal for me. And I went home that night after getting out of jail, and I called my mother and I said, "Mom, I really think I got a drinking problem." And she said, "Hold on, I'll call you right back." And the phone rang in about 5 seconds. It's somebody from Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, she won't admit to this either, but I'm pretty sure she had a red hotline phone to AA. She was just waiting for me to say something that might give her a chance to call. And, you know, I was to get into a treatment center about 30 days later. They just opened one. There weren't treatment centers. I mean, I'd been in a number of laughing academies and, you know, learned how to make wallets and belts and, you know, things like that, and better living through electricity, and, you know, hell, I was 3 years sober before I could plug in a toaster after all that. And, you know, I waited a month. I had a month to get drunk and stay drunk, and that's what I did. And I went in on April 13th, 1983, and they had a meeting at this treatment center that first night, which was a big deal for me because a couple of things happened. I mean, I think they had there was like 20 people in this treatment center. It was small, brand new, pretty much AA based at that time. And they had a meeting there with like 200 people, and I was just watching the people in the crowd, and there was obviously this one guy that was really popular, and Lee Calder was his name. He's been dead for a long time now, and well, not a long time, 7 or 8 years so now. But you know, he was, I don't know, 5'6", really dark skinned Italian guy with a scar down the side of his face. He had on a pinstripe suit and a red tie. He looked like a little gangster, and he walked around like a Bantam rooster. He was just, he's yakking about AA to everybody. And I got him to the side there, or I cornered him somewhere, and I asked him if he'd be my sponsor. And he took one look at me, he looked me up and down, and he said, "Kid, everything about you tells me I ought to run away from you as fast as I can." He said, "But if you're willing to go to any length," he said, "I will go to hell and back with you." And he said, "If you're not, you can go to hell by yourself. Sit down and shut up. Nobody wants to hear anything you got to say. If we want your opinion, we'll give it to you. Just sit down and shut up and listen. Take the cotton out of your mouth or ears, put it in your mouth." And, that was kind of the way it was for the first 8 months. And there was another guy there, Robert Hovland, and he became a good friend too. And Rob was a real country guy. He was a farmer, and he read How It Works that night. And I mean, from that day to this, 37 and a half years later, I have never heard anybody read How It Works like he did. I mean, he had people sitting on the edge of their seat. I don't even know how he did it, but I know when I heard him do it, I said, "I'm going to do that. I'm going to learn how to do that. I'm going to learn how to read that like that." And I started memorizing that thing that night, And I'm a pretty smart kid. And I mean, it didn't take long to memorize How It Works. It's pretty easy. I was 2 or 3 weeks later, somebody asked me to read How It Works in a meeting, and I got up there and I started, reciting it from memory, and I had them on the edge of their seats. And about halfway through it, Lee, my sponsor, stood up in the back of the room. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm reading How It Works." He said, "Read from the damn paper." So I did. And after the meeting, he came running up to me and yakking, waving his finger at me, "You arrogant little puke." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Memorize, you're just trying to impress people." I said, "Hold on a second." I said, "Robert Holland reads it just like that." He said, "Robert Holland can't read, you idiot." And never memorized anything else in the last 37 years. But he came and picked me up and took me to meetings every night because I had no license for the first 4 years, roughly, that I was in the program. He picked me up every night for the first 8 months. And he took me to meetings, and we'd ride 30, 45 minutes sometimes, and he'd talk about Alcoholics Anonymous. You see, Lee, there was a story about him, and I'd never heard it. And when he spoke locally, he spoke all over the place. But when he spoke locally, he didn't tell his whole story. But when he went out of town, he would tell his whole story. And I was 2, 3 months sober. He took me out of town to hear him speak, and he told his whole story. And his whole story was at 18, he got beaten up in a bar fight by 3 guys, and he went home, got a gun, came back, and killed all 3 of them. And he spent 25 years in the penitentiary where he got sober. And he was the worst prisoner in the penitentiary. He was the guy that took the people out of the electric chair. It was the lowest job in the prison, the most incorrigible guy in the whole place. And he was in Central Prison. It was a pretty rough place in Raleigh. And I remember going home that night talking to my wife, and I'm telling her this story, and I'm kind of shook up, and I'm like, I really don't know what I'm going to do. And she looked at me and she said, "You better do whatever the hell he tells you to do." and I did. And, but he was a don't drink and go to meetings guy. And when I always think about this, I just realize how perfect God's plan is for us. I got in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he introduced me to don't drink, go to meetings, put the plug in the jug. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, I did that. And about 8 months sober, I moved to another little town, and I tried to get a sponsor there, and I tried a couple of the old timers, and they were the same. Don't drink, go to meetings, put the plug in the jug. Just don't drink, no matter what. And I'm not putting that down. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I was 13 months sober, sitting on the couch with a gun in my mouth because all I did was go to meetings. You see, I mentioned the triangle in the beginning, and it takes all 3 parts of that for me to stay sober and be happy. And on Mother's Day weekend in 1984, I was taken to a spiritual retreat called Camp Monroe in between Laurinburg and Aberdeen in North Carolina. It's an 11-step spiritual retreat. It's been going on since the mid-'50s. It's the 3rd longest running retreat in AA now. And I went there that weekend. There were a couple men that spoke. They were on the program, and they spoke, and they changed my life. One of those men was Tom Ivester, and Tom's a giant in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he's dying of Alzheimer's right now. He's 63 years sober, and Tom spoke on Saturday night, and at the time he was 52. He was 27 years sober. He got sober when he was 25. I was 24 at the time, and he talked about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and what it done for him, getting him out of a prison in Michigan after killing 2 people in a blackout driving a car. You know, and I spent time talking to Tom that weekend, and he told me things like, kids, at some point you got to give your life to this program. He said, I don't mean you sleep in the AA clubhouse. He said, I mean you become fully dedicated to your own sobriety. You become fully dedicated to living by a set of principles. You become fully dedicated to giving this away to other people. And he said, if you do that, I promise you that you will get more than you ever bargained for out of this program. And Tom became a great friend. He became a sponsor at one point. And there was a guy who spoke on Sunday morning. His name was Art Graham, and he was a Presbyterian minister from Mechanicsville outside of Richmond. And he talked about God in a way that I had never heard before. He didn't talk about it like a minister. He talked about it like a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He talked about it like a drunk like me and how it changed his life. You know, he talked about, you know, that Alcoholics Anonymous has to be one of the 3 center points of your life, that God is the center in Alcoholics Anonymous, and then you hold up the other end. That you know, without God, I can't. Without me, he won't. You know, that I can't do this without his help, but he won't do this without my participation. This is not a free gift. You know, it takes my action, that God is in charge of outcome, and results I get here are based on both my action and God's outcome and his plan. You know, we were driving home that Sunday afternoon, and I was talking to the lady who took me, and her name was Mary Nell Newcomb, and she's been dead for about 15 years now. And we were riding home, and she looked at me on the way home. She said, you know, you're a damn phony. And she said, if you don't do something, you're going to die. You're dying of untreated alcoholism. You know, you're dying of untreated alcoholism. And I'm like, you know, I've tried to get a sponsor. I've tried to do that. And I said, you want to sponsor me? And she said, yeah, I'll sponsor you. And that Sunday night, Mother's Day, 1984, we went home to her house, and we sat down at her kitchen table. And I wish I was with you. I mean, Mary Nell was, you know, she had these cat glasses that always sat on the end of her nose. And she smoked a Virginia Slim 120, and it was always about 2 inches of ash hanging on it. Somehow the ash always fell in the ashtray. I don't know how that works. But, I mean, she'd look down those glasses at me, but we started reading that book that night. And I went to her house for 3 or 4 hours every day for the next 2.5 weeks. And in that 2.5 weeks, we worked the steps. And I don't know if that's good for everybody, but she said, she said, you're going to die. You need to do this as fast and as thoroughly and as honestly as you can. And I was willing at that point to do anything, because my only option was to kill myself. I didn't want to drink. I knew where that would take me. See, I came to Alcoholics Anonymous fully convinced of the first half of the first step. But the first step is 2 parts. You know, it's separated by an en dash, which means those things are not necessarily, and in my case, we're not related. You know, the unmanageability of my life was not due to my drinking. The unmanageability of my life was because I was trying to manage it. You know, she explained to me that I had to have a new manager. I needed a new director. I needed guidance. I needed some other power outside of myself to take control of the outcomes of my life. That if I didn't give that up and let God have it, or let whatever power I wanted to come to understand have it, that I couldn't have this. And, you know, we sat down and we started looking at, you know, this came to believe idea. And I'm like, Mary Nell, I don't think I can do this. I just don't believe this stuff. I don't believe in this this hocus pocus, you know, stuff. And she's like, where does it say you have to believe in anything? I said, well, it says right there, came to believe. She said, yeah, came to believe. Came to believe is over a period of time. You come to believe by doing the rest of this work. I said, I'm not clinically insane. She said, that's not what it's talking about. You know, as we go through the book, we read things like More About Alcoholism, where it talks about the whole chapter about the insanity of the first drink. You know, whether it's the man of 30 or Jim or Fred or the jaywalker, it really doesn't matter. You know, when we talked about that, I realized that, you know, I had for the last 5 years at least tried every day to stop drinking, to not to drink. And I couldn't do it. You know, when she described that, she took me to the 10-step promises, and she said, if you do the work from here to here, by now sanity will have returned. She said, if we go through this book and we go through this work, by now or before now, you will no longer have the obsession to drink. That will not be a problem. And I'm like, okay. So, you know, we start to talk about making this decision, and again, I'm the same problem. I don't believe this stuff. How can I make a decision to turn my will and my life over to care of this thing I don't believe in? She said, you know what? She said, I tell you what, you turn your will and your life over to this coffee cup on this table, and I will guarantee you a miracle. I'm like, whatever. Okay, I'll turn my will and my life over to the coffee cup. What's the miracle? She said, the miracle is your life is no longer being run by an idiot. You know, and then she always referred to me that way, the pet term idiot. I miss her calling me an idiot because it really applies. And I'm like, okay, I guess you got me. And, you know, I think sometimes I miss a word here and there that really is important. And that word care and that stuff is so incredibly important, at least in my life. I don't turn my will and my life over to God. I turn it over to the care of God. There's a distinct and incredibly large difference in those two statements. The word care places the responsibility for action on me. You see, I have to take the actions. I take the actions. God manages the outcome. I'm in the action business. God's in the outcome business. You know, this is why a sponsor is so incredibly important, because if you left to interpret the book on my own, I would interpret the way I wanted to hear it rather than the way it is, the way it's meant by someone who's been through it and understands it and has lived it. And so, you know, I always try to accentuate the idea of sponsorship, because without it, I would have been dead. You know, and I make this decision to just do the rest of the work, because she explained, you know, that's all you can do at this point. All you can do is make a decision, because you can't have a relationship with God. Because if I read the literature, if I read the book tells me that while the deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God, it may be obscured by calamity, pomp, and worship of other things. You know, this idea of God I'm obscured from because of my own self-centeredness. You know, there's no room for God in me because I'm full of me. You know, I'm so full of me, it's running over the top. You know, it's me, I. What do I want? What do I got? What's yours that I ought to have? Why shouldn't I have that? I didn't get that. I deserve that. You know, and this work starts to push a little bit of that out. And when it starts making a crack in that ego and that self-centeredness, and gives God a chance to slip out in my mind, because I don't think God gets in, I think he gets out. I don't think the program is ever about letting God in. I think it's about letting him out. You know, when I start making a crack in this ego foundation that I'm built on, you know, then God begins to sneak out. And as I continue to do this work, I flush more me out of me, and God gets more present in my life. You know, the joy that I've experienced in this program comes by way of the death of me. The program is built to kill me, kill my ego. It's built to kill my self-centeredness, my self-indulgence, my self-absorption. And as I do this, it just slowly happens. You know, we sit down and do this inventory, and I remember, you know, she asked me the question, I said, I don't have any resentments. I don't, and I truly didn't think I did. She said, oh, really? She said, well, okay, well, how about we write down all the stupid people? I'm like, oh, that list is really long. Or, maybe we write down all the people that you hate. I'm like, oh, that's a long list. So we started there. And as I go through this, I realize all those are built on resentments. I'm not afraid of anything. Oh, no, you're not afraid of an angry barking dog. Well, yeah, you're not afraid of a rattlesnake if you walk up. Well, yeah, I mean, you're not really afraid of what people think of you. Well, maybe a little, my life revolved around what you thought of me, although I would tell you the opposite constantly. And I began to see that not only did I fear some things, I feared almost everything. I'd used every person in my life, whether it was familial, friendly, sexual, I'd done harm to every relationship I'd ever been in. The book tells me that the primary thing we fail to recognize is our total inability to have a lasting relationship with another human being. And I certainly fit that bill to the T. And I did an inventory first. I did it, there's a line over in the 5th step in the book where it talks about our life story. I wrote our life story. It was, I don't know how many pages of mostly nonsense, 95% of which had nothing to do with my alcoholism, but that 95% did a great job of hiding the 5% that did. I handed that to her. She balled it up, threw it in the trash can and said, take the book, go follow the directions. So I went back and I started doing that. And I did that. We went through an inventory and Chamberlain was famous for, saying that the program is about uncover, discover, and discard. As I start doing this inventory, I begin to uncover things about myself that I didn't know. With the help of a sponsor, as we go through this, I begin to discover things that I can't see because they can. They're looking at it from a different perspective, a perspective of recovery. And then as I move through 6, 7, 8, and 9, I begin to discard some of these things. And as I begin to discard some of these things, God takes a larger proportion of my life. When I begin to discard some of these things, I begin to think about others a little. I'm not completely self-absorbed and thinking about me 100% of the time. As I begin to do these things, I start to give back. I start to feel a little bit of God's grace. About 3 years in, I went to hear Joe and Charlie for the first time. It was 86 in Biloxi, Mississippi. I think the old goats that used to drag me all over the place. Get in the car, kid. Come on, we're going. I'm like, where are we going? It doesn't matter where we're going. Just get in the car. We get in the car and drive 14 hours to hear Joe and Charlie talk. And I remember sitting there listening to Charlie Parmalee talk about the 4th step and 5th step. And I'm like, wow, I didn't do that. Wow, I never understood like that. I never heard that. And I went home and I started working on that again. And I think I did a fairly good inventory based on listening to those old guys talk about the book. And they helped me more. And I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with them over the years and get to know them. And they saved my life again, like so many others have done. And I went home and I shared that inventory with a sponsor. And, my life changed incredibly. There's some promises after the 5th step, and, a couple of them really were what I felt. And I began to feel the nearness of my Creator. I didn't feel it completely, but I began to feel it, and I had never felt it. I thank God from the bottom of my heart that I knew him better. I didn't know him well, but I knew him better. I hadn't known him at all, but I began to know him. The book's telling me that my spiritual experience, my personal adventures before and after is beginning. As I do this, it's beginning. And, the 5th column of that inventory in Joe and Charlie, that style that they use is my defects. And I took those defects and, 6 and 7 are really short in the book, but I think in another personal opinion, I think they're short because the actual work actually happens in 10 and 11. But, on my defects, I become willing. And, I've learned a lot about this over the years. Yeah, I'm willing to get rid of anger. Absolutely. But am I really willing to get rid of the joy of judgment? You know, there's a line in Bill's story which says, I asked my newfound friend to take away these things, both root and branch. I'm a habitual branch cutter. You know, I'll cut the branch and leave the root. It just grows back. You know, it just continually grows back until I get to the root. You know, the root of most of my problems is in my judgment. The root of most of my fear, or fear is the basis of the root of most of my problems. It's the root of my judgment, and it's certainly my biggest problem today. And I can do it anywhere I go. And these things to me never, you know, my defects kind of never go away, really. They just go off stage and put on a different costume. You know, they come back as something that's a little harder to diagnose and a little more subtle. And, you know, I don't tell you a direct lie. I might leave out some of the truth or forget to leave out something completely to gain an advantage, you know, and that's not honest. You know, I had a terrible habit of walking up on a conversation where two people might be talking about a vacation they'd been on, and I'd walk up and say, oh yeah, I've been there. That's a great place. I've never been within 1,000 miles of the place, you know, and I had to stop doing silly stuff like that to self-promote or make myself bigger than I was, and just to learn to be who I am and what I am, and be happy in that outcome. What time we got here? Stephen, when you want me to stop? 5 till or what?
That'd be good.
Okay. Let me roll through this. I was about 7 years sober in 1990. My dad got terminal cancer, and actually in a 30-day period, my dad died, my grandmother died, and I ended a marriage with one 2-year-old daughter. And you know, my dad and I had made amends, and the amends process is, to me, the most tangible thing that I've ever done. It's the most spiritual thing I've ever done. You know, it was an amazing experience, particularly with my father. It was amazing in a lot of ways, but particularly with him. You know, as he died in the last few months of his life, he wanted to be with me. And if you recall, this is the same kid that was the biggest disappointment in his life, that he wished was never born. In the last few months of his life, I sat with him, I don't know how many times, and listened to him talk about his own mortality. I listened to him talk about his own fears. I listened to him talk about his own regrets about not being a good father. And I was able to tell him that he was a great father. That I was incredibly lucky to have him. You know, and I'm going to fast forward because I always run out of time. He died in 1990. In 2015, I got a box of his stuff from his wife when he died. And that box sat in my garage for about 2 or 3 months. And finally, I went out one day and I got it and I opened it. And I was looking through it. And, you know, it was a bunch of Korean War memorabilia when he served in the Army. And there was a family Bible in the box. And I began to look through it. You know, family Bibles, they had all the births and the marriages and the deaths. And as I was thumbing through the Bible, a piece of paper fell out. I didn't think anything about it. I just reached down on the floor and I picked up the paper and I looked at it. And it was the note that I had left on their kitchen table in 1978. Asking them to please try to keep me out of prison. But on the bottom of the note, he had written a note of his own. And it said, "Thank you, Alcoholics Anonymous, for giving me back my son." I don't know how God works, but I love what he does. I love what he does when I get out of the way. I love what he does when I perform his work well. If I can tell a quick story and just end with this. It's not about me. It's a story I heard that first Mother's Day weekend. Art told it from the podium, and it's my favorite story of all time. And it's about a village in Europe that got bombed during the Second World War, and the Allied bombers kind of made a mistake, and they leveled the village and leveled everything in it, and particularly the church, the place where the people worship was leveled, and it was the center of the village, and they wanted to rebuild the church, and they went to the priest, and they said, "We want to really rebuild it." And he said, "We have no money." And they said, "We'll give you all our money. We'll save everything we have. We'll give it to you, and we can rebuild this church." And they began to collect their money and worth things that were worth, and they'd sell them, and they'd continue to bring money, and they did this for weeks and months and months, and finally they had enough money to hire an architect and draw up plans, and they kept doing this until the point they could hire a contractor and begin to rebuild this cathedral. And as they did it, the plans had in it 3 beautiful stained glass windows, and the contractor had no problem finding plumbers and carpenters and brick masons and woodworkers and things like that to do the work on this cathedral. But he searched all over Europe and all over the world to find artisans for the windows, and he could only find 2. And he was beginning to get worried, and he's sitting in his office one afternoon doing paperwork, and as he does that, the door creaks open, and he looks up, and there's this homely, kind of gruff, dirty little guy that walks in. He doesn't even pay attention. He looks back down at the paperwork. He says, "What can I do for you?" And the little guy says, "I understand you're looking for a stained glass artist." The guy pops his head up. He says, "Yeah, absolutely, I am. You know where I can find one?" He said, "Yeah, I'm a stained glass artisan." He said, "Yeah, right. Sure you are. What's your name?" He said, "My name's not really that important." He said, "But I am a stained glass artisan, and I'm good." He said, "I don't know." But he thought for a minute. He said, "I really don't have any other options. I got nobody else out there to do this." He said, "Okay." He said, "All right, show up Monday for work." And the guy says, "Okay, I'll be here Monday." And he starts to walk out of the room. He stops at the door. He turns around back to the contract. He says, "One thing." He said, "I really don't like to have people watch me work. Can you put a curtain up over my window, and I'll be all right?" And the guy thought, "That's really weird, but okay, I'll put a curtain up." So he puts the curtain up. The guy comes in Monday morning. He stops and he talks and he chats and he has coffee with the other 2 artisans, and they chat for a while, and then he crawls up behind the curtain and he starts working. And all day long for days and weeks, you hear him up there tapping with a little hammer. And it gets time for the church, and the cathedral's ready to be opened. And the guy asked the artist, he said, "Are you done?" He said, "Yeah, I'm almost done. Probably another day or 2." So another day or 2 goes by. He says, "Are you done?" He said, "Yeah." And they start to bring the parishioners around to see the church. He says, "Take everybody around to the other side of the church. By the time you give them a tour and they get over here," he said, "I'll be done." So the contractor takes all the parishioners around. They're looking at the unbelievable marble work and the floors and the tiling and the woodworking and the craftsmanship. It's just magnificent. And they come around and they look at the other 2 windows, and they're just in awe of the beauty. And the guy hollers up to the little guy, and he says, "Are you done?" He said, Yeah, I'm done." He crawls down. They open the curtain from this window, and the people's mouths just hit the floor. It's the most beautiful thing that they've ever seen. And the contractor looks at the little guy and he said, "What is your name?" He said, "I told you when I met you, my name's not important." He said, "What do you think of my window?" He said, "My God, it's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." He said, "But if you won't tell me your name, will you at least tell me where you got the glass for this window?" And the guy kind of chuckled. He said, "Yeah, sure, I'll tell you where I got the glass." He said, you know, every morning I come in here and I talk to the other two artisans. He says, as I talked to them, I reached down in their garbage cans and I pulled out the glass. The glass from my window came from the discards of your other two artisans. Now, that's just a story. But that's the story of my life. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous as a broken, shattered, helpless, and hopeless person who was completely lost. And people like Lee Calder and Robert Holland and Marion L. Newcomb and Brian Bibbins and Tom Ivester and Sterling Watts and Jay Plumback and Sandy Beach and Keith Lewis, and I could name another 1,000, put my glass back together. Without that, I couldn't be the person I am. I owe my life to those people. I owe my life to Alcoholics Anonymous. I owe my life to the God that I came to know in this program. You know, I'm going to say this and stop. You know, there is no growth without pain. Hurt a little. There is no laughter without tears. Don't be afraid to cry. There is no peace without first feeling turmoil in the soul. If you're in turmoil, wait for his peace. And there is no grace without first feeling guilty. If you feel guilty, experience his grace. Thanks.